This is part 2 of our course, in which we undertake a cross-country flight in a glider. We've structured this course around a cross-country glider flight. We'll show you how to operate a glider whilst talking to the appropriate air traffic control units. Along the way, we'll learn what other types of aircraft are doing and how they operate. Although this course is primarily about using the radio, there's a surprising amount of other information to be discovered. As we work through the flight, we're going to be looking at a number of other areas. That includes how call signs are set up, the formats of messages, how we do continuation of communications, readbacks, what sort of controllers are out there, air traffic services outside controlled airspace, the use of transponders, and then what other powered aircraft do for RT. Why are there so many rules, so many things to learn? The answer is, it's to make it easier to be understood. We use a standard phraseology. Radio is a very noisy channel. It can be quite difficult to understand what people are saying. That becomes much easier if the messages are limited to a small number of known items. So we have standard ways of saying things and we order them in a standard way. Sometimes, though, there are things that we want to say that aren't in the book. In that case, plain English is acceptable, though often more difficult to understand. This is particularly useful in gliding, since the rules haven't particularly been developed with gliding in mind. Let's start with the use of call signs. It's very important that both sides of a conversation know who is talking and that there's no ambiguity about it. On the other hand, we want to keep the length of what we say as short as is reasonably practical. So we have full call signs that uniquely identify the station and abbreviated call signs that we can use subsequently. Let's start with ground stations. Ground stations are identified by the name of the location, followed by a suffix. This table shows you some examples. The ones in larger letters are the types that you're more likely to encounter as a glider pilot. Larger airfields may have several frequencies. For example, one for approach controlled, called, for example, Cambridge Approach, and one for local airfield control, Cambridge Tower. The suffix tells you what type of service they are providing. So when Cambridge's radar is operating, Cambridge Approach becomes Cambridge Radar. Smaller airfields without full air traffic control, as we'll see later, usually have the suffix information or radio. Aeroplanes often use their registration as the call sign. This is particularly the case for GA aircraft, and you'll hear a lot of people using call signs such as Golf Bravo Alpha Charlie Delta. This can be abbreviated, and we'll see that in a moment, to Golf Charlie Delta. However, it is entirely possible for other types of call sign to be used. For example, airliners might use their company prefix and a flight number, such as Speedbird 278 for BA Flight 278. Military aircraft have their own system. What about gliders? In principle, gliders are the same as other GA aircraft. However, you will hear that almost always in the UK, gliders use the prefix glider plus their tail number. This works well, but it's strictly not ICAO compliant. So for the purposes of this course, we'll be using our G-Reg call sign. The prefix glider, whilst not required, is actually a very powerful part of the call sign because it improves the situational awareness of both controllers and other aircraft on the frequency. Because the way gliders operate is significantly different from other aircraft, being clear that we are a glider every time we transmit is helpful. We strongly recommend that you use this. So when can we use abbreviated call signs? For us, using our call sign, the answer is only when the controller has already abbreviated it. So at that point, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta becomes glider Charlie Delta. When using the airfield call sign, we can drop all or part of it when it's not confusing, which usually means after the first call. That's because all calls on the frequency not from the controller are directed towards them. We also have some prefixes that we might use. We've covered glider, but student is also available and denotes a solo flight by somebody under instruction. Useful if you're in that situation and want a bit more help or consideration. Here's that rule again and some examples. So abbreviate your call sign only after the controller has abbreviated it. A few examples. Glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta becomes glider Charlie Delta. Golf Charlie Kilo India Oscar becomes Golf India Oscar. And Virgin Golf Romeo India Zulu Zulu becomes Virgin Zulu Zulu. Occasionally, once having been abbreviated, you may hear something like this instruction. Golf Charlie Kilo India Oscar, use full call sign. And that generally means that there are two Golf India Oscars on frequency, and it's important to distinguish between them. Let's have a look at how we talk about levels, heights and altitudes. When you first talk to an ATC unit, it's important that you both agree on which altimeter setting you're using. Only then can you communicate about how high you are. That means that you're going to use the one that they tell you about. Generally, that will be the local QNH. You then refer to your altitude. Sometimes, especially if you're talking to military airfields, they will give you the regional pressure setting. Again, you refer to altitude, but it will most likely be a lower setting than the QNH, and you will be a bit higher than the altimeter says. Occasionally, for example with a MATS crossing directly above an ATZ, air traffic control will give you a QFE, so you know your height above the airfield. Above the transition level, you'll be on a standard pressure setting, 1013, and be talking about flight levels. You need to know which one you're using and why. If this slide doesn't make sense to you, go back and revise it from your bronze course. It's important. For the purposes of this course, we're going to look at a cross-country flight routing Gransden Lodge, Bury North, Lyvedon, Enstone, Wantage, Bletchley and back to Gransden. It's about 380 kilometres and not atypical for a cross-country flight, though we probably wouldn't have planned the Enstone Wantage leg in quite that way, in case we couldn't get a crossing clearance of the Bry zone. But it does give us the opportunity of looking at most of the type of situations that a glider pilot is likely to encounter. Before we fly, we may wish to carry out a radio check. We use a readability scale where 1 is unreadable and 5 is perfectly readable. We may also add additional information, for example if the audio is distorted or noisy. Let's see what that sounds like. Tug Sierra Bravo, glider Charlie Delta, radio check 131.280.
Glider Charlie Delta, Tug Sierra Bravo, readability 5.
Tug Sierra Bravo, glider Charlie Delta, radio check 131.280.
Glider Charlie Delta, Tug Sierra Bravo, readability 3 with a loud background whistle.
A normal call at an airfield with ATC will include the full call sign and the frequency. At a gliding site, it's probably going to be the short call sign without the frequency, since there's no possibility of confusion. Now's a good opportunity to practice. If there's more than one of you, in pairs carry out and respond to a radio check. One person can be the glider pilot and the other person the tug pilot. If it's just you on your own, get a piece of paper and work through the calls. Back to our flight. As soon as we start the task, we need to be thinking about our first call because we're about to pass Cambridge. We could have had Cambridge set as the radio standby frequency before we got airborne. We'll make that call probably in the first or second glide after starting, once we're a few kilometres away from Gransden Lodge and it makes sense to stop listening on their frequency. The time to make the call is when you're high and in the glide, not when you're low or try to concentrate on centering a thermal. Don't forget, if you're looking in to change a radio setting, look out well both before and afterwards. So why call Cambridge at all? As it happens, there's a letter of agreement in existence with Cambridge defining a roughly MATS-sized zone in which we've agreed to do our best to call them. It's not a formal piece of airspace, but it's in the gliding airspace files and we encourage everybody to do it. But we would call them in any case. It's a busy airfield with instrument approaches and we want to be aware of their traffic. We want them to know where we are, and in particular we want them to know how high we are. It's worth noting that although our maps have the approach feathers on them to indicate where the main approaches are, these are by no means the only places we're likely to see instrument traffic. For example, in Cambridge's case, there are holds directly above the airfield and the normal instrument procedures are outbound from those holds and well outside the feathers. It's very helpful to know where you're likely to find traffic for the airfields in the area in which you fly. You can find this information in the AIP or from people in your club who know. Let's listen to the conversation that we have with Cambridge.
Cambridge approach, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, request basic service.
Glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, Cambridge approach. Pass your message.
Glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta from Gransden Lodge to Gransden Lodge, 1 mile south of Bourne, altitude 4,000 feet, QNH 1021, heading east to Bury St Evans.
Glider Charlie Delta, Roger. Basic service, report leaving the frequency.
Basic service, Wilco, glider Charlie Delta.
Now let's look at that conversation step by step. If we've just tuned to the frequency, we wait a little while to make sure we're not about to interrupt a conversation. Then we think about what we're going to say. Then we press the press to transmit, pause briefly, and only then do we talk. An initial call is almost always the same format. Their full call sign, our full call sign, what we want. And generally that means which service we want. And that's almost always basic service. So, Cambridge approach, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, request basic service. It's possible to say no service required, but basic service is generally easier and better understood, and is in fact little different. This call is just opening the conversation. Providing they're not doing something else at the time, we'll hear glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, pass your message. If they're busy, you might hear glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta standby, in which case wait until you're called. It's just possible they'll forget to call back, but wait at least a few minutes before trying again if so. Here's how we respond to pass your message. It's a standard format. First, our call sign and type. In this case, the word glider takes care of the type. Our departure point and destination, our position and altitude, and lastly, any other details and or intentions. On this call, we've told them where our next turning point is. If we were planning to go directly through their overhead, where their hold is, we might mention that.
Glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta from Gransden Lodge to Gransden Lodge, 1 mile south of Bourne, altitude 4,000 feet, QNH 1021, heading east to Bury St Evans.
Glider Charlie Delta, Roger. Basic service, report leaving the frequency.
They respond, acknowledging what we've told them, confirming the service we've asked for, and make a request of us. Now that they've shortened our call sign, we can then use that form.
Basic service, Wilco, Glider Charlie Delta.
We confirm what they've told us. We must repeat the service that they have offered us, and we acknowledge their request. Our call sign now comes at the end of the message. That simple call has used a number of rules that we need to understand. Establishing contact, or an initial call, passing your message, or a full call, continuation of communications, and readbacks. To help you get over the relevant information concisely, there are set formats for the initial and full messages. Let's look at each of those in turn. First then, establishing contact. You, the pilot, pass your initial message. The controller says, pass your message. You then pass your full message. Here's the format of the initial call. Who we're calling, who we are, and what we want. Generally, the service that we want. This is generally the only time we need to use the ground station's call sign. Here's how we respond to pass your message. Again, it's a standard format. First, our call sign and type. So for a powered aeroplane, that might be a PA-28 or a Mooney 201. In our case, the glider part of our call sign takes care of the type. Actual glider types won't be of much use to air traffic control, though if they ask, you can tell them what you're flying. Next, the departure point and destination. This is a standard part of this message and we've included it in this course. It makes a lot more sense and gives situational awareness to a controller for an aircraft who's going from A to B, less so for a glider doing a triangle. You'll find that most glider pilots leave this part of the message out, and air traffic control rarely ask. If they want to know, they can ask and you can tell them. Position and altitude. Where we are, either in relation to some feature they're likely to know, so something big on a 500,000 map, or in relation to their airfield, for example, bearing 260, 10 miles from Cambridge. Don't give this in relation to BGA turning points, which only we know. For altitude, we've included the QNH. In this case, we might have checked the QNH before getting airborne, or by listening on the frequency before calling, heard it given to another aircraft. If we're not using their QNH, they will tell us what it is in the reply, and we will need to acknowledge that. Other details and intentions. On this call, we've told them where our next turning point is. If we were planning to go directly through their overhead, where their hold is, we might mention that. Lastly, any other request. We don't need to repeat the request for the basic service, but if, for example, we wanted a zone penetration from MATS, we should ask. Here's an acronym that could be useful for you in recording a full message. So, CARPAR, call sign, aircraft type, route, from and to, position, altitude, and request. Golf Foxtrot Lima Kilo Sierra, Falk motor glider, from Enstone to Dunstable, 1 mile north of Tame Airfield, altitude 2,200 feet, QNH 1005, estimate Milton Keynes at 23, or VFR tracking to Milton Keynes. We could also say Enstone local. There's a formal format for a position report, which you probably need to know for the test, but are very unlikely to use in a glider. Just learn it. It's fairly simple. It would be used by an aircraft flying procedurally through a series of waypoints and makes it easy for the pilot who is logging the time at which he passes each waypoint. The format is call sign, last position and time, level, and next position and estimated time. The ground station can work out roughly where the aircraft is between the two positions given the current time. So Golf Papa November, Ely 03, 2,200 feet, estimate Cambridge at 12. What are the rules about where your call sign goes? Sometimes we've had it at the beginning, sometimes we've had it at the end. Pretty simple. If air traffic control initiate the conversation, then the rule is the aircraft call sign and then the message. And the pilot reads back and then concludes with the call sign.
Glider Charlie Delta, cleared to enter the ATZ.
Clear to enter the ATZ, Glider Charlie Delta.
But if we initiate the message, and assuming we're not using their call sign, our call sign is at the front of the message.
Glider Charlie Delta, leaving the ATZ, passing altitude 2,400 feet in the climb. Glider Charlie Delta, request airfield information.
There are a number of items which must be read back verbatim. You just need to learn these. This is done for important items to ensure that they've been received correctly. They are headings, levels, including altitudes and heights, clearances involving a runway, so anything to do with landing, taking off, crossing and so on, airways or route departures and clearances, SSR operating instructions, QNH and QFE, the type of service required or wanted, the runway in use, and frequencies. Let's listen to that initial conversation again, now that we can appreciate why it is as it is.
Cambridge approach, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, request basic service.
Glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, Cambridge approach. Pass your message.
Glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, from Gransden Lodge to Gransden Lodge, 1 mile south of Bourne, altitude 4,000 feet, QNH 1021, heading east to Bury St Edmunds.
Glider Charlie Delta, Roger. Basic service, report leaving the frequency.
Basic service, Wilco, glider Charlie Delta.
Another chance to practice. If you can, practice with someone else. If not, take a piece of paper and write out the calls from both ends that you'd expect if you were a glider pilot about to pass an airfield with an air traffic control unit. Back to our flight now. Let's assume that we're doing well and we've progressed through Cambridge's area. We're now getting close to the Lakenheath and Mildenhall combined mats. When might we leave Cambridge and call Lakenheath is a judgment we must make given how close together they are. Cambridge's instrument approaches actually overlap the CMATs. But typically we might change after we pass Newmarket. So how do we do that? Sometimes a controller may pass instructions to change frequency. This might well happen if you're being passed from one service provider to another, as in this example.
BigJet 347, contact rate and control 129.125.
Rate and control 129.125, BigJet 347.
Contact generally means that your details have been passed on to the next station and you won't need to repeat them. Or this might happen.
Golf Kilo Sierra, free call Sywell information 122.705.
Sywell information 122.705 Golf Kilo Sierra.
Here, the phrase free call is used, and that means that your details have not been passed, so you need to start again on the next frequency. In both cases, note that the frequencies given are mandatory readback items. Alternatively, we can tell them that we're leaving the frequency. There are a number of ways to do that. Glider Charlie Delta, changing to Lakenheath radar 128.9. Or Glider Charlie Delta, request change to Lakenheath radar 128.9. Or just Glider Charlie Delta, leaving the frequency. The last of these is probably easiest. Most glider flights are outside the normal procedures where air traffic control would initiate the frequency change. However, we must tell them that we are leaving the frequency. Another chance to do some practice. As a glider pilot and as an ATCO, leave an airfield frequency. Try some of the different ways of doing it. And if there's somebody else there, you can swap roles. In the example flight, we talked about the letter of agreement with Cambridge being like a radio mandatory zone, or RMZ. But what is an RMZ? As of 2023, there are only 2 in the country, Harden and Scilly Isles. But there may be others on the way. The exact rules for each of them may be set individually, so you need to check. But in principle, an RMZ is a piece of airspace where you need to be in two-way radio contact with the controlling authority in order to enter. In Harden's case, there are some alternatives. If you have a transponder, you can use their listening squawk and monitor the frequency, or you can phone before the flight and agree what you're going to do. So there are various ways of doing it. The next background area we need to understand is the classes of controller that we might come across. These are air traffic control, who can issue clearances and give instructions; AFIS, or Aerodrome Flight Information Service, which can give instructions on the ground but only information in the air; and air-to-ground services, which can only give information. Let's go into each of those in a bit more detail. Let's start with air traffic control. A full air traffic control service will have an ATZ and may well be in a Class D zone. The airfield may well have an ATIS, an Automatic Terminal Information Service, which we'll talk about more later. It's quite likely that there will be a number of frequencies and services provided, and an inbound aircraft will work through them. The controllers can issue clearances and give instructions to you. So you may hear cleared to land, cleared to enter the zone VFR not above 1500 feet, join left base, contact line and approach 123.2. In a glider, if you want to enter the ATZ, be ready to change to the tower frequency, since it will be them that will be controlling the ATZ. In contrast, an Aerodrome Flight Information Service, or AFIS, is a service provided at licensed aerodromes by Flight Information Service Officers, or FISOs. The call sign of the aerodrome is then something information, for example, Elstree information. They can't control you in the air, but you still need to talk to them. They can issue instructions to aircraft on the airfield, so you might hear things like taxi via Bravo and Echo, hold short of runway 06. That's a taxi clearance. Land at your discretion, to which the answer would be landing, glider Charlie Delta, or backtrack the active and exit at Alpha. The third type of controller is an air-to-ground operator. That's somebody authorised to operate an air-to-ground service. They can't control you in the air, but you still need to talk to them if you're in the ATZ or circuit area or landing. Their call sign is radio, for example, Skegness Radio. They can only offer you information, so you might hear circuit is busy with helicopter traffic departing to the northwest, or nothing known to affect, or surface wind 180 at 10 knots, or it's all clear above and behind, or tug landing on the east run. There's no guaranteed service and they can go off the air without notice. On this slide, you can see how the RT phraseology differs between the three types of station. ATC can control you in their ATZ and you need their approval to enter, but the other two provide information to aircraft in the air. Study this and be prepared to respond accordingly. Here's how aircraft operate when they're departing an airfield. The differences between an AFIS service and an air-ground service are more pronounced on the ground. In particular, note the differences in the language for takeoff clearances. Again, you need to study this slide. For arriving aircraft, there are again some differences in the phraseology. Remember, only full air traffic control can control you in the air, but you still need to be talking to the other two. At unattended airfields, there are a variety of frequencies to use. In general, glider sites count as unattended, in that they generally don't have any of the three types of air traffic that we've just covered. Rather, they have a frequency that radio calls will be made on. Sometimes, for the larger clubs, the frequencies will be dedicated to that airfield. At other times, one of the common gliding frequencies will be used. For small, non-gliding airfields that don't have their own frequency, the convention is to make the call on SafetyCom 135.480. That should only be done less than 2,000 feet above airfield level or 1,000 feet above the circuit, and within 10 nautical miles, or about 20 kilometres. Let's look at the format of a call to an unattended airfield. Here's what it looks like for SafetyCom.
Borton traffic, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta will be joining downwind runway 23 Borton. Borton traffic, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta downwind runway 23 Borton. Borton traffic, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta final runway 23 Borton.
For an airfield with a dedicated frequency, the use of the airfield name after the runway is probably redundant. Here's a chance to check your understanding. What are the three different types of air traffic control? How do they differ? How does the RT used by them differ? What happens at an unattended airfield? If you can't answer these questions clearly, go back and revise.